Wow, right? Four of the most beautiful words you can say to a writer is, "I loved your book." I've had the pleasure of hearing that a lot. I've written 12 books, but I know that 9 out of 10 of those people are talking about the red tent. And I'm happy about that, and I'm proud about that. We usually have a little conversation. They'll tell me where they got the book. Did someone give it to them? Did they give it to somebody else? Was it in part of their book group? And that's very nice. And very often I'm asked, so where did you get the idea? And I say, oh, that's a long story. Let me leave it at that. Tonight I'm going to tell you the story, or what I remember of the story. Here's where it starts in my memory. It's 1990. It's 1 minute after midnight. It's June 27th. I had just turned 40 years old. I'm sitting on the porch of a beautiful cabin that my husband and I had rented for a week for vacation on Martha's Vineyard. It's beautiful. The stars are out. The air is warm. It's perfect. And I'm counting my blessings. My husband Jim is upstairs sleeping. Our 4-year-old daughter Amelia is upstairs sleeping. Pom the poodle is someplace sleeping. But I'm looking at the sky, and I am counting my blessings. And that includes for me the work that I'm doing. For somebody who grew up with parents for whom work was a paycheck, my job, my work is something that fills me with joy and excitement, and it challenges me all the time. And I am a journalist. And I have the perfect job, my perfect job, which is writing a weekly column for the Boston Sunday Globe magazine about just about anything I want. Some of it's funny, some of it's serious, a lot of it's personal, and I'm working with a wonderful editor. I get to write long feature stories, something that you don't get a chance to do too much anymore for the magazine, and also for other magazines. Also, I've had 2 books published. They're guidebooks to contemporary Jewish practice. I have a 3rd one in production. I couldn't ask for anything more, really. But I'm feeling restless, professionally restless. I've been doing what I've been doing for some time now, and I know how to write a column, and I know how to write a feature story. Not that that isn't difficult sometimes, but I know how to do that, and I'm feeling like I need a challenge in my writing life. And I am, for the first time in my life, toying with the idea of fiction. Now, I had never thought about it before, I think mostly because I didn't have a story. When you're a journalist, there's the story. You tell the story. You learn the story. You shape it. But it's not a story that I came up with. And I had never had a story burning in the, there was never a story in the drawer like some of my journalist friends had. And I had recently gotten an idea, sort of a biblical inspiration. I wasn't hearing voices or anything like that. But I had come across a story in the Bible that was very interesting to me, and that was the story of Rachel and Leah, who are married to Jacob. Jacob is one of the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob falls in love with the younger daughter, and then he is forced to marry the older daughter, and he marries them both. They live together. Leah is the older, not the beautiful one. Rachel is the beautiful younger one. Rachel is barren. Leah has 6 children with him. So there's got to be a lot of tension, and that's where the energy is. That's where the conversation is usually about this relationship. But I thought there had to be more to it than that. That these women had to run a big household. There are ultimately 12, 13 children. So who's cooking dinner tomorrow? Who's driving the carpool? How do you negotiate life in this complicated family? So I thought about this idea, and I mentioned it to some friends, and they thought it was a weird setting. I actually got suggestions from 2 people that it should be about a Mormon marriage with multiple wives, and I knew I wasn't going to do that. For one thing, I didn't want any trouble with the Mormons. And also, I would have more freedom if I was imagining life, thousands of years ago. And I kind of had permission from my tradition to take liberties with this story. There's a kind of commentary called Midrash, which is not about laws and rules and regulations. It's about examining the text and finding stories within it. One definition of Midrash is the stories between the letters, between the words. One famous Midrash, my favorite, is the one about God coming down from heaven to the Garden of Eden in order to braid Eve's hair before her wedding to Adam. It's not in the Bible. It's just, again, what were these rabbis smoking? I mean, that was a mild one. There are some really wild ones. So, but that's part of Jewish tradition, and so playing around with biblical texts, it was okay for me. So I started playing around with this. I started imagining the relationships between Rachel and Leah. I started thinking about personalities, how they would speak to each other, the language, but I didn't have a story. I mean, it was interesting, but I didn't have a story. I was stuck. And I kept reading. I kept reading till I got to Genesis 34, which has a subtitle, which is The Rape of Dinah. The story briefly, as it's told, the family of Jacob is now encamped. They were never settled. They were moving campsite kind of, and they were living outside of the city of Shechem, and one day Dinah goes out from her family home to the city, and she encounters the prince, who's also named Shechem, and they meet each other. We assume, are intimate, because the next day the prince goes to her father and asks for her hand in marriage. Her brothers are outraged and furious because in that universe, no self-respecting, respectable woman would have sexual relations with a man outside of marriage, which was an agreement between the men of two different households. So for them, she had been raped, and she had to be avenged. She had to be avenged. So the prince is trying to talk to Jacob, the father, and saying, I want to marry your daughter, and what are the terms? What terms do I have to come up with for you? The brothers come up with the terms, which are horrific. They demand something of the prince and all of the men of the city that put them at great risk, and then there's a massacre. It's a horrible story. It's one that gets skipped over in religious school. It's terrifying, and I've talked to a lot of people since then, after they read my book, and said, I didn't know that was there. And they went to Cheder, they went to the religious school. They thought they had read the whole Torah, at least the first 5 books of the Bible. Horrible story. And in that story, Dinah doesn't say anything. As is typical in biblical stories, women are often silent, so we don't know what happened from her point of view. And after this story is told, she disappears from the text. She's gone. And I thought, that silence was an open door for me, a door that was opened up by Virginia Woolf in her essay, A Room of One's Own, many, many years ago, which changed my life and I think the life of a lot of women writers and readers. So I thought, I'm going to give her a voice. I'm going to let her tell her own story, and I'm going to give her a second act. She's not going to disappear. She's going to go to Egypt. And in Egypt, she's going to be a stranger, and she's going to be alone and lonely, and if you want to know the rest, you have to read the book. So I had a plot. Now I had a plot, and I had a big challenge, and I started working on it, and I worked on it pretty regularly, but I often had to stop because I had articles to write for which I was getting paid, and nobody was paying me for this. This was my knitting project. I do not knit. I don't do anything handicrafty. It's like I write. So I worked on it. I put it aside. I worked on it some more. I put it aside, and at some point, I put it on the back burner, and the heat went off, and I left it for a while. It was very frustrating in a lot of ways. And then Angels in America opened on Broadway. Stay with me. It was, again, like a call from beyond. I had to go to New York to see it. I read all the reviews. I read everything I could about it, and I I had to see the original production. I wasn't going to wait until it came to Boston. I had to see the original staging, the original cast. And for the first time in my life, I spent real money on theater tickets. I bought center orchestra seats for Jim and for me. Angels in America is a two-part play, so that was two plays. So I got a hotel room for a night, and we went to New York, and we saw Angels in America, and boy, it did not disappoint. It was spectacular. Seeing it for the first time with that cast, it was just mind-blowing. It was beautiful. It was terribly sad. It tells a story from the early days of the AIDS epidemic, and it was also often surreal in many different ways, both visually and in the storytelling. And there's one scene in part 2 where the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg visits the bedside of a dying Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was a slimy Republican lawyer who helped Joseph McCarthy run the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a Red Scare which ruined people's lives. He also was a lawyer for a very young Donald Trump for a while. And he was also instrumental in getting Ethel and Julius Rosenbaum convicted of spying for the Soviet Union and sending them to the electric chair. So here's Roy Cohn in his deathbed, dying of AIDS, but he hasn't told anyone that. He's been closeted his whole life, so he's told everyone he's dying of liver cancer, and Ethel Rosenberg shows up. They hate each other. Oh, boy, they hate each other. And they hate each other on stage, and they spar with each other. They know each other very well. It's a great scene. And then before Ethel leaves, she recites Kaddish for Roy Cohn. Kaddish is a prayer that's said at funerals, at gravesides, and in memory of the dead. It's a way of honoring the dead. She says the whole thing in Hebrew without any translation or explanation, and you could have heard a pin drop. And then she disappears. And then the play continues and goes on. One of many breathtaking moments. That one really stayed with me. In the car on the way home, we were in Connecticut someplace, I said to Jim, if Tony Kushner can do all of the Kaddish on stage without any explanation or any translation, then I can write a novel about a minor character that no one's ever heard of from the Bible. So it gave me permission in a weird way. That doesn't make sense, I know. But it was a very important turning point for me. And I hope you enjoyed that little story. So I went back and I started working again really in earnest. I had a wonderful writing group supporting me and giving me really good feedback, tough love, lots of love. At one point, I sent some of the early pages to my father. My father was my biggest fan. My father gave me my love of language and literature and words. I mean, he would hold up words like they were gems and play with them and laugh at them. And he read everything I wrote. I sent him all my articles, and he always called me and told me how much he liked them in detail. He saved all the clippings in a box. So I sent him some early pages of what I was calling the Book of Dinah at that point. And he kind of apologetically said he didn't understand what was going on here. And I was disappointed, of course, but I also knew that it was a big left turn, and okay, and I decided I wouldn't send him pages. I would send him the whole book when I was done and maybe had a shot at getting it published. My father died 2 years before the book was published, and a little over 3 years before it became a bestseller. Ooh, he would have been over the moon. He would have been over the moon. When he died, I became a mourner, and in Jewish tradition, that's a particular status that gives you a roadway, actually a very specific map through the valley of the shadow of death. And it's very wise, it's very practical, and I recommend it highly. Anyway, the first week you sit Shiva, that Shiva means 7, and you just face the fact that you just lost someone you loved. You don't run away from it. It hurts a lot. My rabbi once told me every day you sit Shiva saves you a year of therapy later on in your life. I think that was probably true. And I sat, and I was amazed at who came to visit and the people who came to visit, even people I didn't know well, and I realized, oh, She lost her father last year. She understands what this is about. It's a club you join when you lose somebody like that. So that's the first week, and then in the first month, you return to life to some extent, and a lot of people wear a ribbon with a tear in it to let people know that you're not quite back, that you're a tender, and you should be careful around me. You also say Kaddish, the prayer that you heard me talk about earlier, Ethel Rosenberg, and you say it in community. You stand up before everyone else and you say Kaddish in memory of the person that you're mourning. And there are other people standing up too, and there's a kind of community and a kind of consolation in that as well. I'm sorry, I get emotional at this point. I miss my father a lot. Anyway, I wrote a book so-called Saying Kaddish the year after my father died. I spent like a second year of mourning, and I learned a lot about the traditions and the histories, and I felt like it was a second year of being in mourning. But that fact informed the writing of that book in a way profoundly. I think it's the best writing I've ever done because it was so close to the bone, it was so close to the experience. But I'm not here to talk about, I wasn't invited here to talk about saying Kaddish, I'm invited to talk about The Red Tent. The Red Tent was published 27 years ago. It's been translated into more than 25 languages. I still get email from people all over the world telling me, I loved your book, and other things, and then telling me where they found it and how it came to them. I get the occasional email from somebody who's outraged at the liberties I took with Holy Scripture, but that's okay, it's fine. And as I said, when people come up to me and say, I loved your book, 9 out of 10 of them are talking about The Red Tent, and I am eternally grateful. The 10th person is usually not smiling. They're often talking in a lowered tone of voice. I really loved your book. And I look at them and say, did you lose somebody recently? And they nod. And I ask about them, and they tell me a few things about the person they've lost. And I tell them about my dad. And I ask if we can hug. No one has ever said no. And that is a blessing that needs no translation. Thank you.